Welcome to the Our Cityscape Podcast, the official podcast of Springville City, Utah, where we publish important information and insightful interviews for the benefit of our citizens. Hey, citizens of Springville, thank you for joining us for this podcast. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what I'm going to call a series of Springville 101. And we have with us today Bruce Riddle, who is our Director of Finance and Treasury, as well as Assistant City Administrator. And we're glad to have Bruce with us. Bruce, could you take just a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been at the city for about 16 years now. Been the finance director here since I started at the city. Before I came to Springville, I was at Provo City. I worked in the power department there as a business operations manager for probably about 10 years, and then I spent about a year in the finance department at Provo also. Went to BYU twice.
Once wasn't enough.
I got an undergrad degree and a graduate degree, so I've got a master's in public administration with some emphasis on finance. And I'm an assistant city administrator, which means I've got several departments in the city that report up through me. In my case, it's the Public Works Department, which is streets and all the underground utilities that most people rely on every day but don't think about every day.
Right.
Water, sewer, stormwater, those kinds of things. And then also our power department reports up through me also.
So, Bruce, just because I know a little bit about the city, you have some pretty major departments that report up through you, especially when it comes to the element of funds for the city.
Yeah, probably I'd have to do the math, but from a dollar standpoint, those departments probably represent close to 75% of the city's budget.
Yeah, they're big departments. Well, thank you for taking a few minutes of your time to be with us today and to talk a little bit about your job and about your role. One of the things that I really want us to focus on, if we can, is the city and a budget and how that works for the city. Probably at a pretty high level, tell us about how that budget and the city works together.
Sure. The city's budget is quite a bit different than what you might find either at your house or maybe in a private business, from the standpoint that in your household or in a small business, it's kind of a rough guideline or rough estimate, whereas in the city, the budget's actually a legally binding document. So it's bound by law. It's adopted formally by the city council. The state law dictates the components and elements that need to be in the budget. And the state law prohibits the city from spending dollars that aren't formally adopted in the budget. So it's a lot more rigid than your family budget or a small business budget might be. And there's a lot of formality around it. So we have to go through, some people call it bureaucracy, but it's really just the transparent efforts of the city to make sure that the citizens who are contributing to that budget through fees and through taxes understand how those dollars are being spent. The budget's really a policy statement by the city council. So the city council really is the one that adopts that budget and approves the expenditures that are going to occur throughout the year by the city in order to provide services to the residents. And it's a policy statement from the standpoint of here's how many dollars we're going to spend on public safety. Here's how many dollars we're going to spend towards parks and recreation or the library or any of the utilities that are offered by the city. So that's kind of in a nutshell what the city's budget does.
Yeah, well, I know that for myself as a director as well, that we live by our budgets. All of our decisions are made based off of those budgets. Tell me a little bit about some of the changing that has happened or changes that have happened more recently with how budgets are put together. I know a while ago we would receive a budget that we had some input on, but it feels like now we're really, as directors, kind of carrying the bulk of that budget.
It's been a pretty good shift, and it's a lot more focus on service levels, defining what those service levels are, and associating the dollars to maintain and sustain those service levels. But as the city grows and becomes more complex, the administration itself can't really keep its arms around the complexity of the city's operations. So we've made a shift over the last 2 or 3 budget cycles to push more of that responsibility out to the department heads and their staffs in order to manage the dollars that are within their budget and to give them more autonomy. They know better how the operations of the city work. So we're trying to put the dollars more directly in their hands to apply them to the individual components of operations within their department that make sense. And as administration and to some extent as city council, we're staying more out of the weeds, so to say, on the day-to-day operations. The city council is still obviously making high-level policy decisions in terms of what broad services we want to offer in the city. So from that standpoint, it's still very much the city council's budget. But the directors have a lot more autonomy as to how to spend those dollars within their budgets.
And not only how to spend the dollars, but when I think about when I think about a budget, there's usually some basic categories, right, of a budget. You've got revenues that are coming in so that you can know what you're going to expense and have to spend. And then also, if you're really good with budgeting, you'll have kind of like an area of a budget that takes money and it's almost like a savings account to be used for special projects or things that are going on. Is that similar to how a city budget would work?
It really is. There is some complexity to city budgets from the standpoint that we operate on a system that's called funds, meaning there are separate funds that really act like separate businesses, if you will, within the city. So we have the general fund, and the general fund provides the basic fundamental governmental services that you would expect. Things like police and public safety, fire department, the library, parks and recreation department, those types of things, and the administrative overhead that goes into running those. But then we have the utilities, for example, or the golf course, and those run much more like businesses. So people pay power bills and their power rates, and all that money is separated and segregated within the power fund. So when a citizen pays their power bill, those dollars go into the power fund. Same for water, same for sewer. Golf course runs much more like a business. And in those cases, user fees are the primary source of revenue for the budget. Whereas in the general fund, there are some user fees. So if you participate in a recreation department program, for example, and pay a fee to play, baseball or soccer, those fees go directly into the revenue department. But the revenue they collect is typically not enough to sustain those operations. And so we use more generalized revenues to fill the balance of that. Public safety, for example, is a huge cost center for us in the city, but the public safety department doesn't really generate much in the way of revenue. And so most of the revenue that they receive come from general sources, mainly taxes, property and sales taxes that support those operations. And then kind of to answer your question a little more fully, we have operations in the city, that is kind of the day-to-day things to keep the city running. Then we have capital budgets that are sort of embedded within that overall budget picture. Those would be for large items like business or buildings or equipment, those types of things. We have a number of funds we have a fund that deals with debt service. So to the extent that we have debt, for example, we issued bonds to build both the library and the rec center. Those dollars are handled through the debt service fund. And then we have some capital funds that are associated with both the general fund and with the enterprise funds. And those are used for big infrastructure projects. And then within each of those funds, we've got reserves. In the enterprise funds, those reserves are what we think are prudent to manage a business of the size and magnitude that they are. So there's some pretty good rainy day funds in the enterprise funds to hedge against the potential for like a natural disaster. If we have a big microburst that knocks down a section of power poles, we've got dollars available to go make those repairs. And those levels are kept at prudent levels for running a business of those magnitudes. And then in the general fund, the same thing, although the only difference in the general fund is that the reserve levels are really dictated by the state. So we have to keep a minimum of 5% of the budget and a maximum of 35% of the budget in reserves.
Okay, so you've mentioned enterprise funds. Those are those business entities that we talked about, like the
Exactly.
power and the public safety and utilities. Or
Where
not
the
public safety, but public works and
public
utilities.
works, anything where the user fees are the primary revenue
Okay.
source for the enterprise.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's huge. I mean, you think about a budget, and people who live by budgets, they kind of understand, but it is complicated at this level, and with all the things. And I love the fact that the city and under your direction and the direction that you've brought with us to us is really looking out for those rainy day funds to make sure that we have the money so that we're not having to go into more debt than necessary, or if something were to happen catastrophically, we have the funds to be able to help us to rebuild, to get back up and operating again.
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about, because this is always a touchy subject, right? It's taxes and how does a city get its funds and its revenues, and I know that as I've learned more about the budgeting for the city, we really have two types of revenues that come in to the city. Far more complicated to that, right? I'm just looking at this at almost the 80,000 foot level. You've got reoccurring revenues, and then you've got like one-time type of revenues. Could you help just maybe give a little bit more insight into what that means and how those work?
Sure. And I don't know if it makes it easier to talk about it in just terms of the general fund versus the enterprise funds. But when we talk about recurring revenue, those would be things like property tax and sales tax, user fees. So when people pay either their utility bill or to participate in a program, those are all recurring fees. We anticipate those dollars will come in every year based on our experience and kind of to some extent what the economy is doing. So there is some fluctuation there. But we also occasionally get some fairly sizable dollars, usually in the form of grants that come from the federal government or the county or other intergovernmental entities. And those are often things we can't rely on every year. So we try to be careful through the budgeting process to make sure that we don't use one-time dollars for programs or staffing that is going to be ongoing.
Right, because there's not that continual revenue coming in off of that one-time source that can sustain an ongoing expense.
Yeah, one of the pillars really of the budgeting process is just that concept of sustainability and making sure that the revenues that are coming in are going to be able to sustain the budget and the service level that's within the budget over the course of time until the city council makes the decision to change, add, or subtract a service level.
Yeah, that's so important. I like that you bring up the service level aspect, because service levels, as I understand them, are kind of the level that we are providing services to our citizens. For example, we take care of resurfacing or protecting roads every so many years, and that's a service level that's been established. Where else are those? I mean, parks and even our equipment and stuff like that, we want to maintain a certain level. And so service level definitions within departments really it plays an important part in the budgeting process.
We've had some focus on that for a number of years, but just over the course of the last year, we've been doing a particularly detailed deep dive into those service levels and trying to make sure that the departments are able to identify and articulate really what those service levels are and quantify them and associate dollars with them. And we think that data will help drive better decisions at the council level as we have discussions about potential new services that we might add, or maybe when the city council realizes the number of dollars we're spending on another service that's maybe underutilized, that might be something we start to move away from.
Yeah, that's huge. I bring up service levels, and I appreciate the added insight that you've shared with us, because one of the things that, in order to maintain a certain service level, we have to have revenues to maintain that. And obviously, reoccurring revenues do come in from utilities and fees that are associated with living and providing services for the city. Also comes in from our property taxes and sales taxes. Where do we stand? Because there's always, comments being made by citizens. Oh, this is the most expensive city we've ever lived in. Oh, this is, the utilities are crazy here. Tell us when you take a look at this, because I know we've had these discussions in city council meetings often, especially around budget time. Where do we really fit if we're looking at Utah County? Are we the most expensive city to live in, or are we kind of middle of the pack? Are we on the lower end? I mean, where are we in that?
Yeah, it depends kind of on how granular you want to take that look. I mean, we have some of the lowest water rates in the county, if not the lowest water rates in the county. Our power rates are right about the middle. Power's a difficult one because you get a few cities in the county that are the power providers, but many, if not most of the cities in Utah County, the residents of those cities are actually customers of Rocky Mountain Power.
So they don't have the city providing that service. They go to a third party.
The city doesn't provide that service. It's a private entity, Rocky Mountain Power, and our rates are lower than Rocky Mountain Power. That's really one of our main benchmarks. If the city is going to offer a power utility, we want to make sure it's done competitively. And if an alternative was to have a Rocky Mountain Power come to town and offer that service, we want to make sure that if we're going to do it, we're going to do it cheaper. And right now our rates are generally lower. It depends on the rate class that you're in, but certainly for residential, we're lower than Rocky Mountain Power. If we move to taxes, that's another question. Sales tax, those dollars are really sort of determined. The rates of them are kind of determined to some extent at the state level. Most cities within Utah County have adopted a PAR tax, which is a component of the sales tax. When you consider all those elements of the sales tax, we're the same as everybody else because there's a state limit to how much you can charge on sales tax. Property tax is where you start to see the divergence a little bit because the city council does have the ability to raise or lower property tax. Property tax can be very complex and probably is one of the most misunderstood elements of a city budget that's out there. So we can go as deep on that as you want to go. But from a high level, property tax is really kind of divided at the city level into two categories, operations and debt service. And from an operations standpoint, Springville has one of the lowest property tax rates in the county. The debt service that's associated with the library and the rec center are layered in to the property tax rate. So we do need to consider that because people are certainly paying that. When we add in the debt service for the library and the CRC, the rec center, we move up slightly, but we're still below the mean for the county. So I think residents of Springville are getting high value for the dollars that they pay, both for utilities as well as taxes that they pay within the city.
I find it interesting as I've sat in on some of our council meetings and public hearings where we talk about if we have to raise the city's portion of property tax. Help, if you can, on a fairly high level. I know that when we get our property tax notices, there's always like a pie chart on there, and that pie chart is divided into different segments. And with each of those segments, there's usually a percentage attached to it. And so I know for myself, I look at it and there's like, Nebo School District comes to mind because that takes such a large part of that pie. And then you can see other segments of it, and there's the Springville City one. Then there's usually like a Utah County one and a Water District one, or other places like that. When you talk about, or we go to the citizens and say, hey, we need a 6% increase in property tax, we're not looking at the overall pie. We're just looking at a sliver of that is Springville's. Is that correct?
Yeah, to put some of that in perspective, the way property tax works in the state is the state authorizes what are called taxing entities. And there are hundreds of taxing entities in the state of Utah. And which taxing entities have the ability to levy a tax against a property is primarily determined by geography. So if you live in Springville, there are sort of and what the best term for it is, sort of overlays
Okay.
of taxing entities that have the ability to levy a tax against a given property. So if you live in Springville, and it actually depends on where in Springville you live, you'll be subject to a Springville City tax. You'll be subject to a Nebo School District tax. The county levies a tax. There's a small administrative tax that's part of the state for collecting and distributing taxes. Central Utah Water Conservancy District.
Right.
And if you're in a certain area of the city, you may pay a levy for the Springville Drainage District. And that's where some of the stormwater goes. And so on your tax bill, you could have 5, 6, 7 different entities that are taxing you. To put it in perspective, the school district is by far the largest component of an individual resident's property tax, representing probably close to 75% of the property tax bill. The city's share of that is less than 15%. I think this last year we were right about 14% of the average property tax bill in the county or in the city. So when we say we're going to raise taxes by 6%, we're really raising 6% of the 15% of your total tax bill.
Right, and that is a 6%. It isn't going to raise both the debt part of the tax. It's just the other part of the tax, just for the operations.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it does get pretty complicated, and I
is.
know from our conversations that we've had, not in this podcast, that it really goes into even far more detail. But I appreciate that insight, because like we'll say, hey, we need a 3% or a 4 or 5 or 6% property tax increase, and then all of a sudden people are thinking, oh my gosh, that's like 6% of my $3,000 property tax or whatever it is. But the reality is, for a homeowner, that may actually only end up being $2 or $3 a year that their property tax will be affected.
Exactly.
For the city.
Exactly.
So
we went through in the state of Utah, if a city or a taxing entity wants to raise the property tax revenue above what would otherwise be certified by the state. And we can talk more about certified tax rates if you want, and kind of how that works, because that is equally complex.
That's another podcast.
We propose to raise property tax by about 3%, which on the average residence in Springville was about $4 for the year.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively small amount.
That's good to hear, because I know sometimes people just, I get that paying taxes is just part of being a part of a community, a part of a state, a part of a nation, right? But, I hope one of the things that people understand is that when we go through this whole process of budgeting and stuff, truly, I know as directors we have many conversations about this. We try to be very aware of tax dollars and the fact that, we pay taxes, right? You pay taxes, I pay taxes, we all pay those taxes. And so we want to be aware, and we want to take into consideration any kind of an additional hardship that takes. And so I know that each year when we do our budgets, we're given the marching order, if you would, to really take a dive into your expenditures and make sure that there's not any of these, like, I don't know what we'd call it, pocketing expense lines, just so that you can have more money to do foolish things with. That's really probably using very citizen-friendly terms. But, the city really does focus on lean, but still maintaining those service levels that our citizens have come to appreciate.
Right.
One other thing that I wanted to have you just do another little dive into is sales tax. When we talk about sales tax, we often think, well, there's a city portion of the sales tax, which is correct. But that doesn't necessarily mean that portion just goes to our city. Because I know a lot of the things that we've seen lately is, well, our neighboring communities, they get all of these developments, all these stores, and we sure wish we had those stores. and because of all the tax it provides to those other communities. Is it truly divided out by, if that is in say Spanish Fork, they have that business, as every penny that is collected in sales tax that may be directed towards city stay strictly in Spanish Fork, or is there a bigger kind of global view of how those funds are distributed?
There's a more global view, and sales tax isn't, it's maybe a little less complex than property tax, but not that much less complex than property tax. When you go to a store, if you go to Walmart or to Smith's, you're going to pay property tax on the items you buy. And just to allude to some of that complexity, you don't pay exactly the same rate because it depends on what you're buying. If you're
Right.
buying food, you pay a different rate than if you're buying tires, for example. But that aside, in broad terms, the way sales tax works is the state does keep track of where sales tax is generated. In other words, the point of sale. But all of that money is collected by the business. They collect the tax. Then they remit all of that tax to the state. The state then does further analysis, and they basically take every dollar that comes in and they split it in half. And half of the money that was generated in the location where it was generated is returned to the location. So
Wow.
half of the revenue that's generated from sales tax in Springville is returned directly to Springville. The other half of the revenue is put into a big pot, a big statewide pot. So every sales tax dollar generated in the entire state gets put into that pot and then is distributed by the state based on population. And so to some extent, we in Springville still benefit from other areas that are seeing big commercial or retail growth. We also benefit as we grow. So as our
Right.
population grows, and particularly if the population growth dynamics are such that we're outpacing our neighbors, we collect more from that pot.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. We want to really kind of start creating the Springville 101 series of podcasts where we can take these little deeper dives into educating our citizens on just what it takes to run a city and all these things that are happening behind the scenes that our citizens just have no idea about. I mean, I had no idea until I started to work in the public sector, which was 5 years ago for myself. And so it's been incredibly eye-opening. So as we've talked about the budget today, I mean, it's extremely high level. There's a lot of things that we can really start to take a little bit of a deeper dive into going forward, like your capital improvement project funds and equipment and all those other type of things. As we think about this wrap up, is there anything kind of in closing that you'd like to share a little bit about this whole budgeting system for the city and
Yeah,
or finance?
for me, one of the main things is in our finance department, one of our sort of mantras or missions is to foster trust, and we think we foster that trust through transparency. So I would invite anyone, if they've got questions about the budget or how dollars are spent, to contact the finance department. There's plenty of information on our website. The finance department has a page on the city's website, and you'll find both our annually adopted city budgets, which is actually a big document, but if you'll spend a few minutes in there, you'll understand much better. It's not all just numbers. There's a lot of sort of policy statements and also performance measures and goals and narrative around how the dollars come in and how they go out and kind of how the budget functions. So that budget document's available to anyone out there. It's also on the state auditor's website. We're required by state law to post our budget on the state website in addition to our city website. And then on the other side, we go through an annual audit through it with an external auditor. That report's given annually to the city council. We post it to the state auditor's website. It's reviewed by the state for compliance. The state has a transparency website, and actually monthly we upload all of the journal entries that every expenditure, kind of like the city's checkbook, is
Oh.
uploaded to the state transparency website. So I just want people to have confidence that there's uh, an effort on the part of the city to build trust through that transparency and a mechanism to see into that transparency. So that'd probably be the main thing I'd want to leave with.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that you bring up the fact that we are audited independently every year, that's a part of the city, that's a part of our policies, it's a part of the state's policies as well, that we pass those audits. And then obviously if there's things found, we work to adjust them, we clean them up. But I can imagine that you at the helm, there's not a whole lot of issues with those audits.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it or jinx myself, but we've gone several years without a finding of any kind, so
Yeah,
we're
well,
proud of that.
that you should be. You should be. Springville City, really quick, and in comparison to other cities our size, are we well ran and funded?
I think we're about as well funded and fiscally managed as a city, particularly of our size, can or should be. We've got a AA plus bond rating, which to me is an important thing. We've got S&P and Fitch rating services that have come in as we've issued bonds and reviewed the fiscal stability of the city. We've got a fairly diverse budget. We have the good fortune of living in a state that has one of the best economies in the country, and that provides another layer of stability. I think you've got a city council that's generally averse to debt, so the debt load that the residents is carrying, while it's not zero, is very low compared to other cities, both in the state and particularly nationally. I think if you look at most cities in Utah, they have considerably less debt than cities elsewhere in the country. So from that perspective, I think Springville's very well run, and it's a great place to live. It's a great place to work. It's a great place to come and recreate. A lot of services for a relatively small amount of money.
I agree with you 100%. Thank you so much, Bruce. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.